Arguably, gentrification started in 1969 when Ken Worpole and Lorraine Worpole decided to settle in Hackney. Realising, of course, in the immediate streets nearby, there wasn't a coffee good enough to fuel their incredible intellectual enterprise. People obviously gathered around the Worpole household, determined to give them the cultural and coffee-fueled environment in which they could then propose their incredible advocacy of this amazing borough. I jest, of course, about the gentrification, but I do not jest in any way about Ken Worpole's importance to Hackney. Please do welcome him now.
Thank you very much. Lorraine Worpole and I arrived in Hackney in 1969. I became a teacher at Hackney Downs School, where I met, and it was very interesting. I liked being a teacher. I didn't like being in the staff room. The atmosphere of the staff room was very, very difficult because there was a new generation of teachers coming in. It had just gone comprehensive, with very different ideas about content or representation, the representation in reading books and in the fiction we read and the ideas we discussed in a very fast-changing borough, whereas it had previously been a grammar school and it was strictly a kind of classical education. The clash between the younger generation was actually quite profound. And two people who turned up at Hackney Downs School at the same time as I was. One was a woman called Margaret Gosley, who became the librarian, and her partner was a black American activist called Glenn Thompson, and Glenn Thompson had arrived in Hackney about 2 years earlier to become an unattached youth worker in Hoxton. But Margaret was in the library. And the other person who I became very close to was a woman called Anne Pettit, who was a remedial English teacher. And so the three of us kind of had a little kind of corner of the staff room. And when I look back at the kind of what happened to that, well, Margaret Gosley and Glenn created Centerprise. They went on to do amazing things. And Anne Pettit, when she left teaching in Hackney, she went to Wales, the west coast of Wales. And it was from her house that the Greenwood Common Women's March started. So there were three of us kind of feeling very much ill at ease in that kind of setting. When I had been teaching, when I'd been learning at Teachers Training College, I had started to subscribe on a student subscription to the magazine New Society. And it was New Society that really first made me think that there is a different way of writing about things, a different kind of area of subject matter. A combination of anthropology, photography, documentary, reportage, that was quite new to me. And in a way it was another revisiting of the 1930s and their interest in mass observation in documentary. So that kind of, the writers there, Raphael Samuel, Raymond Williams occasionally, Ray Gosling, Colin Wall, the anarchist, all these people, some of whom I got to know, were writing from a non-metropolitan way about change in society, particularly in the regions, in the towns, in the cities, in the schools, and not in the universities so much as in the further education colleges and so on. So there was a way of writing that really began to appeal to me. And I literally do remember the first time I read something by John Berger in New Society. It was an extract from A Fortunate Man. And he quoted in that a Russian proverb that life is not a walk across an open field. And I've used it so much that when a Guardian journalist wrote a book recently about the countryside, he cited an aphorism at the beginning of the book: life is not a walk across an open field, and attributed it to me, which is very kind. But that kind of, the Berger book not only had the text, this notion of a vocation, doctor struggling in a place where there's a lot of poverty, life was hard and brutal sometimes, but there was photography as well by Jean Moore. And that combination of text and photography really became extremely important to me, and it was a very new way of doing things. And also I think the notion that the doctors was having a vocation and the teacher having a vocation, again, has struck with me all my life. And it's not a phrase that's used now. I mean, people talk about teaching as a vocation, and the primary they're kind of become instruments of national policy. They have a set kind of curriculum. And when I got to Hackney Down School, many of the things we're beginning to talk about at the College of Education were critically true. I mean, my first article I wrote for the New Society was on Ladybird books. Now, I've got nothing personal about them. I mean, some of them are beautiful in terms of the artists who drew them and so on. But the representation as reading books, the representation of everyday life as family life, was completely inappropriate to what life was like in Hackney. And there were people beginning to do things like that. Lila Berg with her Nipper series, but there were people beginning to start doing reading books and reading schemes and reading series set in different kind of contexts, in multicultural contexts, people living in high-rise flats, people going to the market to shop instead of going to the department store to shop and so on. And the idea then we could start producing our own reading material. So one day, Margaret came seeing the staff room. She said, Vivian Ashford. She said, he's one of my form. So, but he was very for reading, and he was going to the and actually as a remedial teacher. Said, well, he writes these astonishing poems. And she showed me some, and we agreed they were terrific. And so that's it. That went on to eventually be printed. 10,000 copies were eventually published by different publishing companies. It's in 2 major national Afro-Caribbean anthologies of poetry. It was on a television programme. And from time to time, rightly, Hackney Archives and Library do events for schools, touring schools with Vivian's poems. But this was how it started. And Margaret in the library also knew Vivian, because often if he was not in remedial class, he would not bother to go back into the mainstream. He would just hang out in the library. And Margaret befriended him. So the 3 of us had a very close relationship with Vivian, but we could see something there that was going to, really change the way we thought about who should be whose lives needed to be represented in literature. Of course, at the same time, down at Stepney, at Langdon Park School, was Chris Sowell, and famously his students, there was quite a lot of agitation going on amongst schools. And his students came out when he was sacked for literally doing the same thing, publishing children's poetry written by the children who had in some ways expressed in their poetry their dissatisfaction with life, their dissatisfaction with the housing conditions in which they live and the streets in which they try to play, so on. So this became a national movement, but it very much kind of originated in the East End of London. At the same time, in the history curriculum, we were part of our teaching was really about history. And with the geography teacher there, we began to think of Jonathan Cape had just started publishing, some of you here will remember them, some loose leaf folder packs called jackdaws, yeah, containing lots of photographs, historic documents, maps, and so on. And we decided to do one for Hackney, taking passages out of a Hoxton Childhood, taking passages out of Mayhew, and also, interestingly, sending. Now, it would not ever be possible to do that now. We let the boys go out in the groups of 3 for a day, wandering around Hackney with a camera and a tape recorder, just to talk to people in the street. And come back, and they all made their little books about that. They also set up an evening. I set up a WA evening class, People's Autobiography of Hackney. This is actually literally the original poster. Which says a project using tape recorders and cameras to collect people's experiences of schools and education, beginning 7:45, Wednesday, September the 27th, 1973. It's pretty basic equipment. We were using cassette tape recorders, and there was a myth coming around. There are a couple of oral historians in the audience, I know, and I'm sure they will validate this, that if you took a cassette tape on the underground, it would erase it. So from time to time, if you'd have to obviate on not using the underground because you were going to interview, or no, going to the interview was fine, but on the way back you had to. So the People's Autobiography group very, very keen on firstly the jackdaw, and then written. And this is where John Berger does become particularly important, when he and John Moore produced A Seventh Man in 1975. Yeah. We had already done 1 volume of Hackney, Working Lives Volume 1, kind of pre-First World War and so on. The Second World War was a contemporary book, and it is actually a complete homage to John Berger and John Moore. The photographs, the interviews were done by the WA class, but we recruited the Hackney Flashers, which are the largely women's photography collective, commissioned to do the photographs. And it is, as I say, it's a homage to A Seventh Man. And that was very important. The other thing, because I came in earlier to the Birds in Hackney, and this very good talk started off with the popularity of bird keeping in working class families that he said kind of died out in the 50s. So it didn't quite, because one of the things we learned very early on in tape recording, I'm talking about 1971, 1972, 1973, was when we all brought the tapes back to play at the evening class, and we would sit and listen to them, was that the first cohort of tapes came back with largely budgerigars chirping over the top of what the people say. And then there was the clatter of teacups and so on. So we were using very cheap equipment, but we were learning all the time about, really the richness of the spoken word, and the richness and the debates about how you transcribe that, and the degree of respect you paid to making sure that the people who had been recorded were happy with their transcript. There was a debate going on at the time. There were purists in the oral history movement who said you had to include all the ums and ahs and repetitions and so on. This was the authentic voice. My position, or our position then, was no, the authentic voice is what people, when given their text back, are happy as representing them, because they don't want to be. I mean, if you hear a tape of this talk now, or if you hear a tape of yourself having a chat to someone, you wouldn't want, I didn't say that. Did I mean that? You want the kind of the flow of the text, and that was. So in 1974, Glenn left Centerprise. It had started in 34 Dawson Lane. It also had a children's bookshop at 66A Dawson Lane. And the reason there was such a gathering of alternative organisations in Dawson Lane at that time was for something some people may not know. It was on a 3-year low rent. It was just a 3-year temporary lease. A meanwhile use is what they're now called. The reason being that there was going to be a 4-lane motorway coming down Dawson Lane off of the M11. People remember it was called the London Bot Scheme. It was going to go through past St Pancras, along Euston Road, and come out the other side of Westbrook Park. Because they couldn't, they had to kind of not be able to put all those shops on Dawson Lane out to commercial use. So you had Help the Aged, you had Freeform, you had two black music record shops, you had the Origin recording studio for the exploding deck chairs, which someone has claimed were the original punk group, but lots of other things going on in these cheap rented places. Centerprise did move in 1973 to 136, 138 Kingsland High Street, where it stayed actually for nearly 40 years. But the Berger thing was really very important. And when Glenn left Centerprise, he wanted to continue. I mean, he was completely excited about Vivian and some of the other stuff we were beginning to publish at Centerprise. And he then he befriended John Berger, and the two of them decided that they would start up the Writers and Readers Publishing Co-operative. And the degree to which that kind of Centerprise experience was central in a way to a lot of John Berger's thinking after that is in the wonderful loving obituary that Berger wrote in The Guardian on the 12th of September 2001 of Glenn Thompson. It is difficult to write about a hero because a hero is defined not only by his qualities but by his actions. And whereas qualities can be enumerated in an obituary, actions, if they are made to be clear, demand another kind of undying space. Glenn Thompson, a pioneering publisher who has died aged 60, was, for me and many others, a hero. He was born in Brooklyn to George and Clara Thompson. But his mother died when he was 11, and shortly afterwards his father was sent to prison. Glenn and his younger brother Dennis spent their time on the streets of Harlem and were later placed in institutions. His gratitude to an unknown teacher who taught him to read and write was to polarise the rest of his life. He left New York for Europe in his early 20s and hitchhiked to India and Nepal, where he had a rendezvous with a woman with whom he had fallen in love. Leaving Asia, he worked for 2 years on a kibbutz in Israel, and it was there, I imagine, that he first encountered the experience of a working collective. Books for him were inseparable not only from action, but from the principle of sharing. Hence his lifelong intransigence to everything elitist. After Israel, he returned to New York to set up a reading clinic for literate Puerto Ricans. And here, Glenn, this kind of what we were doing was again very much influenced by as my teacher training experience of the ideas of Paulo Freire. Glenn's heroes were the Brazilian educationist Paulo Freire, who wrote for Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the subversive philosopher Ivan Illich, after Discordia, and more recently the Indian storyteller Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things, about a deity who supports the peasants of Kerala in their fight to keep their land, threatened today by the construction of merely money-serving dams. For Glenn, literacy was more than the capacity to read, it was the capacity to lay claim to a legitimate inheritance. In the late 1960s, he came to London with his first wife, Margaret Gosley, and set up the bookshop and cultural meeting point Centerprise in Dalston. Against establishment predictions, polite variants on the theme Pearls Before Swine, the project works and still flourishes. This was in 2001. In 1972, Centerprise printed its first book of poems by the black poet Vivian Ashwood. Glenn believed that one reason for publishing books was to allow existing voices to converse with world literature, prophetically imagined books as websites. In 1974, with his second wife, Sharon Williams, and others, he started full-scale publishing with the Writers and Readers Publishing Co-operative, most notably producing the first beginners' books, which explained to readers, not in arduous, condescending manner, but with a certain streetwise insolence, the theoretical heritage of Marx, Einstein, Castro, Darwin, etc. It also published fiction by, among others, Neil Jordan and myself. After a decade, the London Co-operative went bankrupt, and Glenn returned to Harlem, where he published black writers, and particularly poets, such as Aisha Bandele, Sophia Henderson Holmes, and Mari Evans. If poetry was the literary form he responded to most naturally, it was perhaps because poetry draws windows everywhere, and Glenn loved windows as much as he hated shut doors. Condemned by cancer, Glenn oversaw his own death like a general. He had his own special way of walking down streets and through crowds, and I remember this. He was both confident and wary. He knew where he was going and nobody was going to stop him. But if they were there, he spotted them. The last time I saw him walking like this was on a crowded platform at the Gare du Nord in Paris in July. He leaves 3 children, Shoshana, Benjamin, Elisha, 2 grandchildren, Nathaniel and Robert. And then at the end of the handout, there is a photograph, because when John Berger died in 2017, there was the Stoke Newington Literary Festival that year, a guerrilla poster maker who came to the event but would not give his name. He called himself Protest Stencil. He had managed to do an enormous poster the size of one of those bus shelter inset hoardings, illuminated hoardings, and he had opened all the bus shelters in Stoke Newington to put one of these posters in. And my good friend Gareth at the Literary Festival had one of the posters. The Protest Stencil donated it to us, and he auctioned it. The winning bid was made by Lorraine Wolfe, on condition it was mounted in Stoke Newington Library, of which Berger was a user when young. John's daughter, Katja Berger, attended, but spoke about her father at the unveiling. That was very special for Lorraine and me. So that's kind of a life in 20 minutes. And I'm very happy that if we want to chat about some of these different.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. I mean, it's such a vivid portrait of that early 70s period in Hackney. You mentioned Dalston Lane, which of course was later written about at great length by a wonderful cultural historian, Patrick Wright, called A Journey Through Ruins, where he kind of captures a lot of that kind of spirit and the sort of sense of how it tied in with a national shift in cultural terms, and a sense of a way of thinking about Hackney in that kind of transition. Could you give us a sense of what kind of activity was happening? I mean, was this a kind of pan-borough sense of possibility, alternative creativity, education, culture, performance, theatre, etc., or was it very specifically localised?
This is a very good question, because I think what we really have lost in the 1960s, the GLC, the Race on the Council, ILIA, the Inner London Educational Authority, had established a number of teacher centres around the whole of the Greater London area. There were teacher centres for science, technology, teacher centres for literature, English, geography, and so on. And they were there for in-service training. And it was, for example, at the English centre, the English teacher centre was actually located at Highbury Corner, and that was where a lot of the teachers of English went for in-service training. In fact, I had forgotten this, but I went there the year I left teaching, 1973, in April 1973, and the first speaker I heard was the anarchist Colin Wall. And we went, and I was sitting next to someone called Blair Peach. who was again a very important radical in the teaching of English. He worked at a special needs school in the Mile End, still there, beautiful building. So there was that kind of support for this, and then as a result of that, a lot of radical English teachers set up Teaching Under Kids, a magazine with lots. I interviewed Raven Williams for but the idea of now producing teaching materials much more based on the experience of London life became very central to the whole pedagogy of English teaching. That it was the kind of the crisis of representation all over again. So there was that. Yeah, I thought there was that kind of strong support.
You mentioned key figures, Colin Ward, of course, who you, again, advocated for the work of in all sorts of ways over the decades. Blair Peach, a crucial figure, killed by the police in Southall, of course, a few years later. And we should obviously honour Vivian Usherwood's memory. He died tragically in a house fire, aged 21. So that promise was lost. But all those that kind of passing suggests the vulnerability of all sorts of class structures in Hackney at that point still. Vulnerable housing, precarious housing. His own life was very precarious, of course, despite this creative, flourishing that was just beginning. What was your sense of Hackney's relationship to the larger city? Because Harold Pinter, talking about his own childhood in the late 40s, said that, you could get to Piccadilly on the bus and it would cost 10p. It would take you about 40 minutes, but they didn't have 10p. So they had to walk around Hackney, walking and talking and thinking from Springfield Park to Hackney Downs, down to Hoxton. And that's where a lot of the good work was done that then, set him off on his way with inspirational teachers like you and also with friends. Did Hackney feel like it was available, to the city and vice versa? Was there a porous relation?
I think so, yes. I have a thing about Pinter. It's interesting that when I arrived in 1969, the staff room at Hackney Downs School all had Pinter sat there, Pinter did that, Pinter did that. They never mentioned Alexander Barron, the communist. Never mentioned him. They never mentioned Abraham Gaines, who we're celebrating this year because he was the designer of the Festival of Britain project. Yeah. It was only Pinter.
Yeah.
And Pinter might go to Southend, but go to the West End, but Alexander Barron famously, on the launch of his first great novel, the First World War novel, the first Second World War novel, which my memory, everybody knows it, is From the City, from the Plough. Fantastic book. Cape had launched it at Cape headquarters in Bloomsbury Square. Barron got on the 73 to go down there.
Yeah.
Stopped off, got into the square, looked up at the Cape's lighted windows, saw all these crowds of people, and got back on the bus and went home.
Good place.
So it was different. There was that kind of, mind you, I remember trying to get, waiting 3/4 of an hour for the 73 fast.
Yeah, exactly. I guess Pinter might have got the 38, when he did get when he saved things up. Yeah. No, you're right, of course, there's always a bias, there's always a hierarchy of memory and recovery and so on. But I think also what Pinter did do is remind people through the work, because many local references went into the early plays. The Caretaker was filmed in Hackney Downs by Richard Donner, who went on to make Superman, among other things. The house is gone now, but the locational areas remain. But also he also said alongside that comment about the bus that Hackney was a place. It was a real place. It wasn't just somewhere that you lived. There was stuff in it, like it was layered and textured, and it had history. Yeah. And of course that's what you're celebrating here. John left London in 1962, went to Geneva and then to the French Alps, and his kind of connection with London was slightly broken for some time as a kind of cultural space. What do you think that he took from his time in Stoke Newington and in Hackney and the wider city that you can sort of trace into those early books, perhaps?
I think a good way of starting that is to read his short story Islington in what I think is, I think The Fortunate Man is his best book. His second best book is Here Is Where We Meet. a collection of imaginary stories in which he meets people who are now dead. But in the opening story, which I think is superb, he goes to Lisbon, and one day he's out walking and he meets his mother, and she's been dead 10 years. And he tells her, you know, all my stories are about you. And he confesses lots of things, and she tells him lots of things. But the second story is Islington, and that's where he had his first love affair, and began to get it because he was then attending art college. And that's that's very located in Islington. It's in Noel Road. Coming back to the old history thing, it wasn't always complicated, because occasionally I would do things like, well, with the boys, going and interview your grandfather, see how, that would be interesting. You can bring back and tell me some of his stories. And the next day I was called into the headmaster's office, and he said, Mr. Worpole, the parents of one of your students has complained, and they don't want their son to hear anything about his grandpa or know anything about his grandfather, and we would prefer that you didn't organise things like that. I mean, that's legitimate. Yeah, I mean, you don't know what you're barging into sometimes, and you have to do these things with sensitivity. But there was much more freedom in the schools then. Now, coming back to Pins, I got some years ago, an academic did a book about gentrification in Stoke Newington. And he blamed it on the white middle classes arriving and displacing or the white working class. Completely unhistorical. He didn't mention that in 1950, 50% of the population of Hackney was Jewish, not Orthodox Jewish, secular Jewish, on their move out from, Stepney and Aldgate and Bethnal Green, to Stoke Newington, Hackney, and then on to... But, Hackney was by then, it was multicultural, 50%, he was very involved in tenant associations, in political parties, a lot of Jewish councillors. And the idea that suddenly the white working class had been displaced by the white middle class was the story of Hackney, was a complete nonsense. Hackney is a century of incoming different nationalities and so on. And I think, the Pinter thing is one side of the Jewish Hackney, but there were lots of other sides, and I think Barron was very good at showing some of the others.
Absolutely. And of course, Caribbean community and the Irish community as well was very distinctively present in Hackney. I think of just a couple of writers. Timothy O'Grady lived for a long time in the larger Dalston area.
Jerry O'Neill.
The
Duke of Wellington Park.
5
novels, great novels, yeah.
Ronan Bennett came to Hackney nearly 50 years ago, still lives here. The writer and creator of Top Boy, among much else. So there's a sense of Hackney being open and welcoming to people, whether officially or otherwise, but the actual, on a street level, until property took a radically different course, there was a sense of that possibility, and people could come and find a space and a foothold there.
Yeah. Well, and squatting was very central. In fact, Sandbrook Community Playgroup, which about 3 years ago celebrated its 50th anniversary, in the house they own as a trust, was actually squatted by Lorraine and other women in the 1970s to run a playgroup. And it was so successful, and Hackney then had an oversupply of empty properties, in which what they did was they simply poured concrete down the toilet of anyone, of all of them, to stop people taking over. What can you get a worse image of what you do in human habitation is to make it impossible for other people to live in.
No, it's absolute disgrace.
So so squatting kind of did produce. The photographer
Tom Hunter,
of
course. Yeah, might well be talking this weekend somewhere.
No,
Beck Road, the artist's street, of course, just off London Fields.
Beck Road, yeah. Philip Hall came for Beck Road, and so did
Yeah, I mean, it was a widespread sense of things. Just before we open it to the audience, Sian Williams, of course, Glenn's widow, continues with extraordinary children's literary advocacy around the country, has done for decades. Obviously yourself, Lorraine, and others. There was a sense that that moment really kind of consolidated a way of being in the world that obviously had then have to be, a little bit like John's obituary for Glenn, both confident and wary because funding changed, councils changed, politics changed. The old ways just couldn't keep going on. You had to find new ways of doing things, but the value system was in place about that relationship to community and creative possibility. Do you sense that possibility still in different forms now?
In some ways, yeah. But we have to recognise demographic realities. I mean, I think this current thing is that something like between 50% and 70% of all local authority spending now is on adult social care. Yeah. I mean, the demand for care for the elderly, so because of the demographics, is so enormous now. There's less and less. And of course, I forgot to say in the context was because the GLC, apart from having its teacher centres, had a big arts budget, and had this notion of ultra vires. You are all. I mean, it's not true that councils spend money on anything. They can't. They're completely constrained by what they can spend money on. But there's one small let out which is called the ultra vires course. You can spend 0.7% of your budget without providing a legal, without finding a definite, it being under some kind of legal obligation. So you have a freedom over 0.7, and that for the GLC was a phenomenal amount of money. Yeah. Hence, in the 1980s, with the Livingston thing, you saw the proliferation of black recording studios, gay bookshops, theatre groups, all sorts of things out of that fund, either through the Community Arts Subcommittee or through the Great London Enterprise Board. And that's what you can do. I mean, you can do with a very small amount of money in a big organisation.
Yeah.
And we do need that kind of seed funding.
No, we do. And 0.7%, of course, it's also the national development budget for overseas development, which has now been whittled down, of course, under the previous administration. Famously, John McDonnell, the treasurer of the GLC, turned the 1 million, I think, that was the 0.7% budget into 3 million through canny investments, and transformed that landscape until, of course, exactly 40 years ago last month, the GLC was abolished by Margaret Thatcher. Things change, and this time is also changing very fast. It's now your moment, the audience moment, of course, where we want to hear from you in the spirit of organisation. Yes, please, sir.
Just to say, I briefly worked for Writers and Readers as a sales rep, and this thing about did Hackney have a dialogue with London kind of thing, or did it influence on? I ran around the whole country, and I think what was really interesting, and it's perhaps obvious in the room, I know I'm sitting amongst a whole spider's web of people here who have got their connections, the oral historians, the squatters, the legacy of, or the long tradition of New Beacon books, of Walter Rodney, later a Bogle Louverture bookshop, the black education networks that were around that linked in with what Ken was talking about, the ILIA, all were sat alongside and supplemented what the ILIA was doing, I think was a really interesting point. And the last thing I'll say, running around the country, News from Nowhere, still going, the bookshop in Liverpool, just a whole, I don't want to run through the whole repping list, but there were a lot of bookshops around the country which reflected that need to publish local stories and local voices. So.
Tremendous. Thank you so much for that first-hand witness. Yeah, and there are a number of those bookshops still remain, don't they? From Houseman's in St Pancras all the way across the country. Thank you so much. Any more thoughts, comments, responses? Were you there? Do you wish you were there? Are you glad you're there now?
Up there.
Ken came through. Yes, please.
Okay, I wanted to ask you talked about Dawson Lane, and on Dawson Lane was Hackney Co-op Developments.
Right.
And it's still got a sign there, but they're now up at Bradbury Street, which I was involved in developing that wreckage, basically, that was there at the time in 1980. They became a co-op, the Readers and Writers Co-op. What was the idea behind becoming a co-op, and how did they go about finding
Centerprise
out?
was not. It was a trust.
Okay.
Yeah. It was It was run on collective line. Yeah. So everybody. People who don't know it, but it started off as a bookshop and a coffee bar in Dawson Lane, but it moved to two shopfront premises and the upstairs in Kensington Hyde. There was a children's nursery in the basement. There was a the bookshop and the coffee bar on the ground floor. Upstairs was a legal advice centre, and upstairs, further upstairs, the publishing project and an adult literacy centre. So their whole idea was that people come without any kind of stigma. If they wanted advice on the housing or something, they could wait in the bookshop and have a coffee, or they were going up to the reading centre because they were learning to read. Mixing all these things together, the high and the low. Wait, I don't want to call it that, but the elective and the non-elective, or the necessary requirements to live and the sociable, were all mixed up in the same building, which was tremendously important.
Yeah. Before we go, I'd just like to draw your attention, if I may, to some Berger business happening this year. Of course, John will be 100, and I say he will be because he's still with us, as Simon McBurney famously tweeted when John died. Now John is everywhere, and not just in the French Alps and Paris occasionally. So on the 5th of November, John will be 100, born the same year, of course, as David Attenborough, just about almost exactly 6 months later. And he was born at 1 Filey Avenue, if you want to make a pilgrimage there at any point from now till the 5th, or even after. 1 Filey Avenue, Stoke Newington, and he was there. We're thinking about putting a plaque up there. Various structural issues, as often is the case with contemporary society. However, good Berger news, lots of reissues from Verso books, new covers, extras and so on. Also from Bloomsbury Publishing, a whole raft of new editions with special introductions. Here Is Where We Meet is being reissued with a major foreword by Anne Michaels, the incredible novelist, poet, and John's frequent collaborator. In the first week of September, I think I can say it now, there is a key person from the British Library in the room. I'm now going to say it. In the first week of September, there is going to be the launch of Tom Overton's many years in the making biography of John Berger, called From Life, John Berger From Life. First week of September in the British Library. Lock that date. In the first week of November, the London Review Bookshop will be doing a major event with many people participating. Sign up to those lists if you'd like to. And two very special publications. John and his second wife, Anya Bostock, the translator, translated Bertolt Brecht's poems for the theatre. They have not been seen since pamphlet publication in Norwich in 1971. Obviously a key outpost of Berger pamphlet activity. They're being reissued in a massively expanded edition by Tenement Press. Brecht's Poems on the Theatre on the 30th of October. And around that time also, Four Horizons, John's visit to Ronchamp Church, the Corbusier masterpiece, with two American nuns. I'll leave it there. What did they get up to? You'll find out in Four Horizons, published by Objectif Press. Objective with an F. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to Hackney History Festival.